Hello, and in this tutorial I'll be showing how to assemble a Learn to Solder kit. The kit comes with two PCBs. They look like this. You may notice that they look like the Gaiman basic chin boards, and that's what they are, but the manufacturer didn't drill them right, and if you look at the very bottom, you can see that the holes have been drilled. I don't know if it's showing up very well, but yeah, so they're kind of useless as the Gaiman chin boards. So the only use for them is just to practice soldering and solder a couple of components on them and just get some practice in. You also get a handful of LEDs. These are just random LEDs that I have. Each kit comes with a handful of them and enough to solder them into place. And let's see what's next. So up next are a handful of ceramic capacitors. They're orangish. There are about 8 included in this kit. Again, they're a random value. And next are the resistors. They're a random value. These are quarter watt. Not much to say about these. You get about 8 in the kit. Included are 8 electrolytic capacitors. These are also random, and the ones on my hand are 4.7 microfarad, but that doesn't really matter. Let's see what's next. The chips. So these are 16-pin chips. These are 74HC164 shift registers, and you also get a length of lead-free solder. This is the solder I like to use. It has some flux on the inside, which makes soldering just a little bit easier. So for the tools, you need a soldering iron. The one I have is a Heiko FX888D-23BY. I highly recommend this iron, but any iron will do. And you also need some helping hands, and these are very nice for holding the PCB into place when you're soldering components. And you also need some flush cutters, and you also need some safety glasses, because soldering can be a little bit dangerous if you get molten soldering iron, so just watch out for that. You also need a damp sponge. Mine happens to be included in the stand of my soldering iron. You need a damp sponge in order to wipe the corrosion from a soldering iron. You also need some desoldering wick. It looks like this. It's basically just braided copper wire, and it helps suck out solder if you need to replace a part. You also need some soldering flux. You can use a flux pen like I am, or you can get some paste, but either or will work. So we're just going to take a PCB and we're going to place an LED into there. So what you'll notice is that an LED has a flat side and a round side. There's also a long pin and a short pin. And those fit in like that, where you have the short pin on the right, long pin on the left. Just push that into place, bend the leads over, and then what we're going to go ahead and do is solder it into place. I'm going to place it in my helping hands. Grab my soldering iron, then what I'm going to do is apply a little bit of solder to the soldering iron, and then heat up the joint with the soldering iron, and then apply some solder. And if you do this right, and you have the right temperature soldering iron, the solder flows just as easily as that, and you make a nice solid connection just like that. So now I'm going to take my flush cutters, and I'm just going to bend the leads a little bit so they're easier to cut. And then what I'm going to go ahead and do is just cut off the leads. You don't want to cut too far, just a little bit is sticking out. That's fine. So there's one LED, and why don't I show you how to solder another one. Again, I'm just going to place the short lead on the right, long lead on the left, and just push that into place. Bend the leads over, just like that, and then clamp it in my helping hands. And again, I'm going to solder it into place. Add a little bit of solder to the soldering iron, heat up the joint, add some more solder to that, and you're done. And same thing for the other lead. And trim the leads off of that too. And we're done soldering LEDs for now. Of course, you want to go ahead and solder more LEDs and get more practice. But next, what we're going to go ahead and do is mount the chip. And the chip looks like this, and you're going to try to jam it into place. But the problem is, if you try to just fit it without bending any of the pins, it doesn't fit. The pins on the chip are a little bit splayed out. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just kind of put it on the table and kind of roll it forward to bend the pins in a little bit more so that they are more or less parallel to each other. And here's another chip for reference on the left, and you can see the one on the right is the pins are parallel, the ones on the left, the pins are splayed out. So you want to bend the pins in a little bit so you could stick them into the PCB and so they fit. So I'm just going to go ahead and stick a chip into the slot there, and then what I'm going to go ahead and do is, using my flush cutters, I'm going to bend some of the pins so that the chip stays in place when you flip the board over. So I've done one side, and let's see, kind of still falls out. So I'm going to go ahead and bend the top pin too, so that the chip is retained and we can solder that into place. And to solder the chip, I'm just going to add a little solder to the soldering iron, heat up the joint, and then push some solder in there to complete the solder joint there. And you want to do that to all the pins. Keep in mind that you don't want to bridge the gap between the pins because you'd be shorting some part of the circuit out. It doesn't matter in this case because this is just for practice, but if you're assembling a real kit, you definitely don't want to short out any pins. So here I am just soldering one by one all the little connections between the PCB and the chip, and just go one at a time, solder them into place. Almost done there, and we're done, and it looks like this. You could see that none of the gaps are bridged on the PCB, and then if you touch it, it's kind of sharp. So what some people tend to do is just take your flush cutters and just clip off the little pins that are coming through the PCB in order to make it a little bit not as sharp. And as you can see, the ones on the right are still a little bit pokey, but those are done. Now we're going to go ahead and do the same thing with the other chip. Again, I'm going to bend it forward and bend the pins in a little bit more, and then I'm just going to try to place it into the holes just like that. And then I'm going to take my flush cutters and just kind of push a pin at the bottom over and then a pin at the top over so that the chip stays in place. And we're going to go ahead and solder that together. Yeah, it's just the same procedure as last time. Here I've sped this up for you so it's a little bit easier to watch. Now that everything is soldered, or at least the chips are, we're going to move on to soldering the next component, which is going to be the resistor. And what you want to do is you want to bend the leads of the resistor into kind of like a U shape. So just like that, and so that it fits onto the PCB. And the little spots there are for the resistors. So I'm just going to jam that resistor right in, pop that into place, and then flip the PCB over and then bend the leads, and that resistor is ready to solder. So I'm just going to go ahead and solder that into place. Same procedure, heat up the joint there and add solder to one pin and then the other one. And I'm just going to bend the pins up and then trim them off with my flush cutters. And we have that resistor soldered. Now we're going to solder another resistor to the left of that one. And again, you want to take the resistor, bend the pins up, and then wedge that into place right next to the other resistor. And then you want to bend the pins down, and then we're just going to solder those like we did before. And we're going to trim off the excess leads on this one also. And then the next object we're going to solder, the next component we're going to solder is the electrolytic capacitor. And I'm going to go ahead and solder it into that spot there. Typically these are polarized. There's a plus and a minus on the capacitor, but in this case we're just practicing soldering, so it doesn't really matter what way you put it in. And bend the leads and just solder that into place just like we did with the resistors. And then we're going to clip off the excess material, the excess leads. And then we're done with the electrolytic capacitor. Now we're going to solder the ceramic capacitor. And this guy isn't polarized, so just kind of place it. And I'm going to choose that spot there to place it. And then again, I'm going to bend the leads so that we can get our soldering iron to there and solder it into place. Once that's soldered, I'm going to lift the pins a little bit so that I could clip the excess material off. Alright, well that's a bunch of the components soldered. And you just want to do the same thing to the other PCB. It's similar, but it has a couple less components on there. So yeah, that's that. So that's pretty much it for soldering the components onto the PCB. Moving on to a different section of the tutorial. Say, for instance, that you suspect a capacitor is bad, or perhaps you soldered it backwards. So what you do in that case is you just chop that capacitor off, and we're going to solder on a different one. This is pretty much the same technique you follow if you suspect you have a bad resistor, or perhaps you soldered a resistor incorrectly. But yeah, in this case, we're going to pretend it's a capacitor. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is first I'm going to add a little bit more solder to the solder pads. So now that there is some solder on the pads, I'm going to go ahead and take the capacitor. I'm going to measure how much of the capacitor I need. I'm going to bend the leads, and then I'm going to chop the leads off so that the capacitor fits within the designated area. And then I'm just simply going to solder on the leads to the pad. And the capacitor is soldered, and that's it. That's how you replace a capacitor or some other component that you think is bad. So say, for instance, that you think you have a bad LED, or perhaps you soldered an LED backwards. Well, in this case, what you want to do is heat up the back of the LED with a soldering iron, and then just pull on the LED until it comes out. And that way you can remove the pins that were stuck inside the PCB and the whole LED. However, this did leave some solder inside the little pads. So what we're going to go ahead and do is first you need some soldering wick and you need some flux, and what you're going to go ahead and do is take the flux and you're just going to dab the affected area, the area with the pads that are filled in with solder, and we're going to try to use the solder wick to suck out the solder that was there. So to use solder wick, all you need to do is just place the solder wick down and heat it up with your soldering iron until you get the solder to flow, and typically it comes out of the solder pads. Sometimes you have to attack it from the other side, and again it's the same thing. Add some flux, heat the solder wick up with your soldering iron while pressing down onto the pad, and typically you could get the solder out of there. However, every once in a while you might see that you damaged a pad and you can no longer fit a pin through there, which is okay. There's a way around that too. So this is what happened in my case. I was able to get one solder pad emptied out of solder, but the other one didn't want to come out. So what I did was I stuck the LED in and I bent the pin that wasn't able to solder in, and I just lifted it out. And the pin that did fit through the PCB, I went ahead and soldered, and I clipped the leads. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is grab a small piece of wire, piece of scrap wire, and what I'm going to go ahead and do is solder the wire to the leg of the LED that could not be pushed through the PCB. And I'm just solder the other side of that wire right up to where the LED should have been soldered on the other side. And this technique works most of the time. So that's another option to try to fix a PCB that's been, improperly soldered with a bad LED, or perhaps an improperly soldered LED. You don't need to go through all these elaborate steps if it's, a capacitor, resistor, or anything. You can just slap that capacitor on like we did previously. This is just for, LEDs that need to stay in a particular spot, or else, it just doesn't look very good. Now that LED is repaired, and we're going to move on to something different. So say, for instance, you have a bad chip, or you suspect you have a bad chip. So the way to fix this is to, replace the chip. What you could try to do is try to desolder all the solder and then pull a chip out. That's a pain in the butt, and I don't like doing that. So what I like to do is just take my flush cutters, jam them into the pins, and just cut the chip off as I am right now, and just throw that chip away, and we're going to solder a new one on. Be careful when doing this because you can scratch up the pads on the PCB. You might cut traces, but it works most of the time. I have that spare chip over there, and what I'm going to go ahead and do is add a little bit of solder to the top right pad. That's so I can tack on the chip and then solder it on later. You'll see what I mean. So I'm going to add a little bit of solder, and then I'm going to take the chip. I'm going to try to place it where it should go, like that. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is heat up the little solder pad that I added, and I'm going to try to solder that properly to the top right pin. Hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully you can see what I'm doing. Once that's soldered, we can move on to soldering the rest of the pins, and just solder all the way around the chip, and that's how I recommend replacing integrated circuits. That's about it. So thank you for watching, and until next time, bye-bye.